Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Welcome to my home, what you can see of it. Unfortunately, or fortunately, as many of you may know, I live in Greece, and we have, in my apartment, I have a major problem with light and controlling it. So I had to close lots of windows and things to try and make sure that you weren't being blinded and I became a silhouette. So I hope the lighting is okay. And I hope you can all hear and see me. It is kind of weird, being at least virtually back with you guys in Latvia. In fact, Latvia was the last country I visited before they locked us all down and all international travel was cancelled. So it's nice to be back with you, even in this format. And just a couple of words before I get going. As a representative and as a consultant with a publishing company, one of the things that we have found in this rather difficult period is how inventive and how determined teachers can be to keep things going despite the difficulties. And many of the emails we get, for example, have been about working digitally, working at a distance, teachers suddenly having to kind of get used to systems and ways of doing things that they've never had to do before. And I must admit, it's been very impressive, the determination that we've seen over the last few months from quite literally all over the world. So my congratulations to you teachers for remaining undefeated in spite of everything that's been going on. And my metaphorical hat off to you for all the work that I know you've been doing and all the difficulties I know you've faced. So my congratulations, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know if there are any gentlemen. The only names I saw were those of ladies. So let us get down to business today. This presentation I have entitled Being More Productive. When I was in Latvia earlier this year, one of the things I was talking about was the art of communication. I was looking at it from a slightly more, if you like, abstract, more theoretical kind of basis. And what I wanted to do today, because there were a lot of interesting comments and discussion about that. And what I wanted to do today was to try and take that into a more kind of practical sphere and talk a little bit about how we can help our learners with their productive skills. Obviously, we're looking at writing and speaking. So what I did was to think about some of the conversations I've had over the years and the email communication that we have with the people we work with over the years. And also I took my experience in my bio. It also says that I work as a translator and a proofreader. And over the years, as a proofreader, usually of translations into English, I have come across some very interesting use of language and noticed some very interesting patterns in the way that English is produced by non-native speakers. And what I wanted to do today was also to draw on some of that experience and share some of those ideas with you and maybe leave you with things that you'd like to look out for when you're doing your work. So the emphasis here will be slightly on the higher level learners. I'm going to be honest with you here, and I mentioned that in the abstract, but I do hope there's something for everybody in today's presentation. At certain moments, I will be asking you for your contributions. If you're familiar with Zoom, you will know how the chat function works. If you're not familiar with Zoom, you just kind of need to go to the control panel and you will find the chat applet, which you are more than welcome to open. There will be moments when I will be asking you to contribute. And also, hopefully, although I always say this and finally we always run out of time, at the end of the presentation, at least in my mind, I have left space for questions, comments, that if you'd like to make comments or you have any questions at the end. This does not mean that I necessarily know all the answers, but the great thing about this kind of gathering is that we have a great deal of collective knowledge between us. So I would welcome, if there are any questions that come up, if any of you feel you would like to contribute your experience, that would be absolutely wonderful. What I do ask for practical purposes is that if you do have comments or questions, please put them in the chat. If people start opening their microphones, it is going to get a little chaotic. I have had Zoom meetings recently where someone thought their microphone was muted, and in fact, they were having an argument with their husband at the same time, and that was rather fun. So please do keep your microphones muted, but by all means, contribute to the chat. And I have it open, so if you see me looking away, that's where I'm looking. Okay, so I think that's organizationally everything I wanted to talk about. Let's get down to business. Whenever I talk to teachers, it always seems that the productive skills are foremost in their mind, that reading and writing do seem to be the areas, especially at the higher levels, I think partially because of examinations, that teachers seem concerned about. So I'm going to start with a question, and excuse me if I keep looking away, I'm working on two screens here. Let me ask you the first question and see how good you are at typing in a hurry. Why is it that it is very common for learners to find productive skills so hard? Why do we find as teachers that productive skills can be very hard to teach? And if you can go to the chat now and type in some ideas. And remember, no one can hear you. So it might actually be easier this time if you do have any questions, any points to make in this particular case. Why are productive skills so hard? And oh, there we go. For those of you who haven't got the chat open, we have, because they're trying to think and produce at the same time. There's a useful comment there, and we will be coming back to that. Anyone else got any comments? Productive skills so hard because they have to make something, not take something already made. Yeah, that goes for so many things in the modern world, including things like cooking and eating. In fact, it is a major issue. We'll be coming back to it in just a second. Okay, I presume people, there we go. They're afraid of being judged. You guys are writing my presentation for me, and I thank you for it. We'll be talking about all these on the next slide. Just going to give a few more seconds because I know it's difficult sometimes to type things in. It takes rather a long time to master, not immediate result. Productive skills require a lot of practice. They try and want to be perfect. That is something very important that we will be coming back to a little later on. You can keep adding those, but for the purposes of time and to make sure everything runs according to schedule, because these things are very important, I will go on to the next slide. And if you have any comments, by all means, please keep adding them. I'll check them out as I see them coming in from the corner of my eye. It's a lot about practice, learners being afraid to make mistakes. And I think a lot of these, thankfully, I have covered in my next slide. Certainly, we get into what is known as increased cognitive load. And those of you who've been kind enough to join me in real time, real life presentations will know, if you remember, if you don't, I shall remind you, cognitive load is a very important factor in so many things. For those of you maybe not familiar with the term, although I think you can probably guess it, but let's all be on the same page. Cognitive load is basically the amount, and I'm going to put this very simply, so please don't be insulted, the amount of brain, if you like, that you're having to use at any one particular moment. The more cognitive load, the more your brain is working, and after a certain point, you get into what is known as cognitive overload, when your brain is basically trying to do too many things at once, focus on too many things at once, at which point you get a kind of an emotional response to that. You kind of have a cognitive thing going on, and that feeds into a very negative emotional response, which basically goes, I can't deal with this. The example I often give when I'm talking about this is because I've had these moments, like when you're in the supermarket, and maybe I don't have them, but if you have kids, your kids are talking to you, you're trying to do the checkout at the supermarket, the phone is ringing, the person working the checkout is asking you questions, and you're having to deal with a whole bunch of things at once. And your brain basically goes, I give up. I can't deal with this anymore. When I was studying, one of the things, one of the exercises that we had to do was basically what we called a hot seat exercise. Now, I'm not necessarily recommending this to try, but maybe you want to do it at some point, or even with your colleagues, or as an activity at some kind of training event. You get one person sitting on a hot seat in the middle, you have a person either side of them asking various questions. So one may ask you to count from 1 to 10, for example. The other person maybe asks you to do a physical movement or asks you a personal question. And you get this sensation of having to switch your focus from one to the other and just try and be there and focus at that particular moment. It's not an easy task to do, but it does kind of lead you into the sensations that learners can have when they're being asked to do a lot of things at once. And cognitive overload is something that we really need to bear in mind when we're doing anything in the classroom, but especially the productive skills, because as many of you have noted, these are the most demanding things that learners are being asked to do. So one of the things, of course, that we can do when we're trying to reduce cognitive load, to give practical advice, is to break things down. Even if you think your learners are very skilled, even if you're teaching one of the higher level classes, just throwing an activity at learners is always going to increase cognitive load. Now, some of them may just manage it. But if, for example, you're doing a speaking activity, breaking things down step by step, and we'll talk about this, is a great way of reducing cognitive load, and very importantly, the negative kind of emotions that go with it. My next point is lack of experience. Now, this is not just lack of experience of language, although obviously this is part of that equation. And it's very important that we remember that our learners do not have experience of everything, although some of them, you know, in their teenage years can start to look rather mature. And obviously these days, their experience of the world is broader than maybe it was for some of us at the same age. It is very important to remember that our learners don't have huge amounts of experience. And I'm going to come to that point in just a minute. Technical knowledge, this is my way of just talking about things like the nuts and bolts of the language. Technical experience, technical knowledge, how the language actually works. And as some of you quite rightly pointed out, when you are doing the productive skills, especially things like speaking, I think there is much more danger of learners feeling embarrassed because they feel that they may be being judged. So let's have a look at some of these very, very quickly, because I want to get into the practicalities. The increased cognitive load will certainly come, as I mentioned already, from complexity. If we're asking learners to do too many things at once, if, for example, we're asking them to talk about a situation or role play a situation about which they're not particularly, with which they're not particularly familiar, what you're going to get is a bunch of things going on in their heads. So they have to try and understand the situation. They have to try and think about the language. They have to focus maybe on what the other person is saying. Maybe they're trying to remember something that we mentioned in the past. Complexity will increase cognitive load. Now, at some point, that's going to have to happen. But as part of the training process, as I've mentioned already, we really have to reduce that. Another area, according to research, where cognitive load increases is when they're using language in a way, or if the learner's native language is terribly different from the language they're trying to use. So that will vary from country to country. It will also vary from situation to situation. If we use specific language structures in a specific situation, for example, I remember my experience teaching here in Greece. An example I use a lot, for example, the use of things like the imperative. That structure in Greek is very different from the structure we use in English. And what you find is there, because those structures are very, very different, and obviously the learner's mind is also playing their native language in their head, if you like, and if there's a big kind of shift in the way we have to look at things, this can increase cognitive load dramatically. And this is where, of course, the teachers come in almost all cases. Certainly my experience in Latvia is that the teachers speak the learner's native language. And there it's very, very important that you use your knowledge of how different things are to prepare the learners beforehand for those structures that may cause complications because they are so very different from the kind of the structure of the language that the learners are being asked to produce. And of course, this happens in writing as well. But in writing, the difference is, and this comes on to my next point, in writing, we do tend to have just a little bit more time. In writing, learners can think things through. And this is something I'll be reminding you of a little later. that when we're doing, for example, speaking activities, planning and time is very important. I came across a lovely example when I was doing my research and reading up and etc. for this presentation. Even in our own language, if we're having to think quickly or speak quickly, for example, if you're having an argument like the Zoom thing the other day, and you're listening to someone and you're trying to get your points in and you're angry and the conversation's happening very quickly, even in our own language, we can kind of stumble over words. We can get lost in the argument. You know, sometimes it's like, what was I saying? Timing, giving time for learners to prepare, especially in speaking, has been demonstrated to increase the quality and quantity of speech. So if we're looking at getting our learners to be more productive, if we're looking at lowering that cognitive load, certainly giving them just a little time. It doesn't actually need a lot. It may be just a minute. A minute's actually quite a long time, and for many speaking activities, it's more than enough. Give our learners the time to think things through and just kind of run it through in their head a little bit before they get into it. Lack of experience. Now, this is a very interesting area, and it may be the case that some of you, for example, are teaching learners kind of more technical language. Maybe you're looking at English for specific purposes, etc. But this is also true of things like general course books, that there's an increasing tendency for course books to be aimed at the age group who will be using the book. So, for example, at the upper levels of things like high school, for example, it is quite common for the issues to be dealt with to be teenage issues, for learners to be exposed to language which is relevant to their experience at that particular time in life. And that is completely appropriate for reasons I'll mention in a short while. But we also have to bear in mind that the language we're going to teach them does need to have a kind of eye to the future. So that if we're teaching language now, yeah, teenage experience is great. But for example, there are certain ways of writing, more formal emails, for example, and the perennial letter of application, which many of you will have had to teach, or even things like a letter of complaint, that learners as yet really don't have experience of. So one of the ways that productive skills can become difficult is not just linguistic. It is in a sense that learners lack the real life experience, even in their own language, of having to deal with those particular circumstances. And of course, there we'll be thinking about things like preparing them, etc. And I will be coming back to those ideas fairly shortly. I just mentioned the second point there. Also, if you're preparing learners for communication outside the classroom, which obviously is the point, there are things like cultural differences that we do have to think about, and even age-based differences in the way that we communicate. So when we're preparing learners for productive activities, we really do have to contextualize the speaking and the writing in such a way that our learners will be able to understand some of the more subtle differences. And of course, those of you may be working at slightly higher levels. Maybe some of you are teaching business people. Maybe some of you are teaching it, again, at the technical level, where communication, obviously outside of the learner's home environment, is going to happen. Things like cultural issues may have to be discussed. This is something we talked about on my tour when I was there earlier this year, so I'm not going to dwell on it. But for those of you who weren't with us, just this idea of not everybody thinks the same way, not everybody does the same things, and giving learners just that little bit of experience in other people's cultures. This has happened, for example, I remember a very clear example many, many years ago when we were doing proficiency examinations, preparing learners for proficiency. There was a question in the composition, a productive skill, that was talking about a school sports day. Now in the UK, a sports day is usually a kind of fun event. It's nothing very, very serious. It's really just about having fun and people taking part in stupid races. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but things like the sack race, where you get into a big sack and you have to kind of jump to the finish line, you can't run. And my favorite of all time, which is completely ridiculous, is the egg and spoon race, where you get an egg and a reasonably sized spoon, and you have to run along the course carrying the spoon and if the egg falls off, you have to stop and pick it up. These are fun events, and there are many more silly ones. You can maybe check it out online, I don't know. But we, in terms of my learners, had a major problem in that in their culture, they don't have the sports days. When they hear of sports day, they think of a major athletic event. They think of, you know, hurdles and 100-meter sprints and all kinds of things. So the communication there kind of broke down. And what the learners wrote, now I'm not sure how they marked it, and thankfully most of the learners passed, but an experience of different cultures is going to help when learners are being productive, so that they are more aware. And very importantly, they talk about their own culture. They explain things that someone outside may not know. So part of being productive is not just producing language, it's producing appropriate language for the situation, whether that's business, whether it's cultural, whatever it may happen to be. So we do need to focus on that when we are teaching our learners to be productive. Obviously, and this is not gonna take very long, the Queen. Someone just wrote the Queen. Has she arrived? Is she watching the seminar? My word. Maybe a knighthood in the offing, who knows? Actually, she's isolating at the moment anyway, so if she's here by Zoom. But I think what someone mentioned here is the kind of very weird thing to write. I'm not quite sure what that's doing there, but okay, the Queen is there. Not going to spend very long on this one. Obviously, I don't need to stress to you the importance of technical knowledge. But again, this goes back to cognitive overload. If I want my learners to be productive, I have to make sure that they have the relevant language skills, whether that's the grammar, the vocabulary, or the contextual awareness and how that affects the language that we choose, to be able to participate in a task. If they don't have all that information, obviously, then they are going to get into cognitive overload. Their production is going to go down, they're going to stumble, they're going to dry up, or their composition is not going to be terribly good. Just to finish this part of the presentation, we mentioned that productive activities are difficult because there is a danger of embarrassment. And this is one of the areas where motivation can get severely affected. Especially in things like speaking. I think it's much more prevalent there, obviously. It can demotivate learners. If every time I open my mouth, I feel like I'm an idiot, basically, then my learners are not going to want to contribute. And of course, as many of you've mentioned, practice is also a very important part of developing productive skills. If every time I practice, I feel stupid, obviously I'm going to try and avoid it. And if I'm avoiding it, I'm not getting the practice, my productive skills are going to suffer. Now, one of the ways, of course, we can deal with that is by getting our learners as much experience as we can give them. And this goes right from primary level. These ideas of just getting learners to use the language. And as someone mentioned, and I thank them for the comment in the chat, that confidence is built, especially when you lose fear of making mistakes. And this is an atmosphere we need to set up. It's an atmosphere that needs to be created, that when we're trying to produce language, especially in spoken form, but it also goes for written form, that we don't worry about making mistakes, that we consider mistakes a natural part of the learning process. And of course, this is very much teacher-led, and I will be giving some suggestions about that as we move forward. But I do want to make a little comment here, and I'm sorry. This is something that I've noticed as well. Especially when I teach, and this is something I discussed with my other colleagues who do this job, that we do find as well that teachers are often kind of reluctant. If we were doing this live, for example, and I asked, does anyone have any questions or any comments? There is often a reluctance amongst teachers to kind of put themselves out there. So I do ask you as well, when you're dealing with your learners, to think about yourselves too. When I travel around, obviously I travel to many countries. There's no way I could speak the language of every country I visit. And when teachers are speaking to me, there is no judgment going on, for example, on my part. We have to get rid of judgment. I'm very grateful for any effort anybody makes to speak to me, and the mistakes are just completely irrelevant. So please, when you're thinking about creating the atmosphere in the classroom, do reflect on yourselves as well. How much you are affected by making mistakes, if you do make mistakes, how much you are self-conscious, because there is a danger that the way you judge yourself can also affect the way you judge other people. And at the end of the day, especially as regards mistakes, putting judgment on one side, I'm not talking about correction, I'm not talking about getting things right, but this kind of idea of judgment does have to disappear from a classroom if we want our learners to be more productive, okay? So, now, sorry, I'm just gonna have a quick look at some of the comments here. I'm disappearing from your screen. Okay, nothing really. Someone just made a point there. We're going to get back to this idea of how we deal with corrections and remain non-judgmental as we go through. Okay, so this next slide is a couple of quotes I came across in my preparation that I wanted to share with you as we move into the more practical side and make suggestions, and I'm going to ask you to get involved in things as well. This first one, I'll be honest with you, really made me sit back and think. Do we see our learners as learners of the language or users of the language? Yeah, this is one of the things that I kind of sat back and thought, you know what? This is something I've never really considered, not explicitly. And this is the great thing, by the way, about doing presentations and working with colleagues like yourselves, that it really does make me think about my own teaching and the world in which I work in a professional context. Do we see our learners as learners of the language or users of the language? Obviously, in the community classroom, in the world of the Common European Framework, it's very important, I think, that we focus on the second, that our focus is shifted from learners of the language, if you like, as an academic subject, to training users of the language. And following on from that, this is a quote from Littlewood, a foreign language is learned primarily for contact outside one's community. And I think this is very important as well. The contrast here and before the ellipsis is basically saying that a second language is learned to communicate within a community to which you belong. A foreign language, which is what most of us are teaching, is learned primarily for contact outside one's community. So when we're doing things like role play, when we're doing things like encouraging learners even to do things like presentation work or whatever, please remember that it's very hard in what is usually a kind of homogeneous classroom environment to remember that learners, when they are using language, will not be, English as a foreign language, will not be just using it with their classmates. So when you're setting things up, this is where I'm coming back to things like culture as well. Cultural information, exploring the culture of the target language. It doesn't have to be England. It could be anywhere that English is spoken. I really don't care. But exploring that culture, and if you're contextualizing language, for example, in something like a role play, do remember that it'll be outside. Maybe when you're doing role play, you can give them maybe different national identities. So for example, you're not speaking to a classmate, maybe you're someone from Riga or wherever, who is speaking to a visitor or who is corresponding with someone abroad, and just get them to have that in mind. It does make a subtle difference in the way that we do things. From even down to things like giving directions. If you're giving directions to someone who's local, you're going to do it very differently from giving directions to someone who doesn't know the city at all, who's maybe a visitor. You're going to have to describe the landmarks more clearly. You can't take so many things for granted when you're explaining that. So do make sure when you're giving your learners activities that sometimes, not every time, but sometimes you do play around with that particular dynamic in a productive activity. Just a thought, something you might want to play around with, especially those of you maybe who are teaching things like English for specific purposes at the much higher levels. Okay, types of productive activity. This goes for speaking and for listening activities. I'm just checking over here. No, we're still good. There are basically two types of productive activity that we do in the classroom. And again, I'm sure you're very familiar. I just want to remind us of this because I'm going to use it as a basis for some discussion in a moment. There is what is referred to as form-focused, and then there are ones that are broadly referred to as meaning-focused. And it is very important that we identify which is which when we're doing things in the classroom, and it's usually quite obvious. which activity we're doing, because that is going to affect how we correct and how we deal with or assess a particular activity. I'm not going to focus too long on form focus because it's fairly straightforward, and I know that you're very familiar with it. I'm very quickly going to show you a page from somewhere. Don't worry, this is not going to slip into advertising. But for example, it's very common these days when we do things like grammar, everybody's favorite, to these days, and quite rightly, turn that into some kind of controlled communicative activity, going back to this idea of learners as users of the language rather than learners as learners of kind of a more academic form of the language. But here it's very form focused. So you've done your preparatory work, you've gone through, in this particular case, differences between tenses. At the end of the activity, and I hope you can see it just right down at the bottom, there is a short productive activity where learners do a controlled activity based on, if I remember correctly, making arrangements with somebody else. Now that is form focused. It is not a truly communicative activity. So our working with that doesn't have to have such communicative considerations. This is entirely about getting the tenses right. So here we will give very explicit correction. We will focus on the specific target, and of course it could be a lexical exercise, it could be something like that. And we're very, very specific about the feedback, and it will be very, very targeted to the particular structure that we are looking at that particular moment. So please remember that. And there, I wouldn't worry so much about setting up a massive kind of context for it. I'm not really going to worry too much about the subtleties of role play. What I am going to do is be listening out and get my learners listening out for the specific target structure. So form focused is fairly straightforward. It's when we get into the meaning focused that I think we start to have difficulties in my experience. Before I zoom into this next stage, I just got my eye on the time. Any questions or comments that have come up so far? Any comments anyone would like to make? Just going to make a slight kind of minute here if there's anything anyone would like to add before I move into the next stage. Or is everyone okay and happy? Or has everyone gone off to make themselves a cup of tea? Talking of which, great thing about Zoom is that you can take a sip of coffee while you're doing the activities. Give me 1 second, please, because I do have a dry throat. No, no one has any questions. Excellent. So you're either all sure and comfortable. Everything is okay. Thank you very much indeed for commenting and letting me know there are still people out there. Alrighty, I'm going to move on if anything comes up as we go through. And do bear in mind in a couple of minutes that I am going to ask you to participate in a couple of activities. So have your chats ready. Now, meaning-focused activities, and remember please, I'm at the higher end of the school at this particular moment, going into maybe university level, technical level, or whatever. I'm not focusing right now on the primary level. One of the shifts that we have seen in recent years, and I talked about this at my last live, I think, participation with you guys there at the Latte conference a couple of years ago, is this idea that of things like presentation skills have been becoming very much a demand, in fact, from many education ministries. And because I did a whole kind of thing about this, I'm not going to spend very long on it. But I just want to remind you of a couple of important factors if we're asking our learners to produce. Again, I'm taking some examples. Don't worry about where they're from. I'm just going to go through this very, very quickly. One of the things we can do, remember, this is what we call extended monologue. And I'll look at the other versions, the other alternatives in just a minute or so. But if we're asking learners, and this becomes increasingly common, to do some kind of extended monologue, to be able to speak maybe for 2 or 3 minutes. Someone's happy, that's cool. I like people being happy. If we're asking learners to speak for 2 or 3 minutes on a subject, you can see here automatically how the cognitive load is going to become a factor in kind of maybe blocking or slowing down their communicative skills, their productive skills. This is just one I took from one of our books. Imagine you're a tour guide in a museum, give a presentation about the Nabateans to a group of students visiting the museum. Now, if we're going to ask learners to do a presentation of this nature, we've got to be able to keep the cognitive load down. So obviously, what I'm going to suggest here is this idea of making sure that before we ask learners to do something like this, that we don't throw them in at the deep end, that we do give them things like models and get them to look at the structure. This is equally important for writing as it is for speaking. In order to reduce cognitive load, we have to look at models. And something I've said a million times is when you're looking at models, please, 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 please look at them very proactively. Look at them in great depth. If we want our learners to be more productive, we have to give them input. And this is where kind of the receptive and the productive skills come together. If I want to be productive, I have to have received information beforehand. I have to have some idea in the speaking or the writing. I know you guys know about the models. I'm not pretending you're hearing it for the first time. But what I do want to stress is that it's really, really, and this has come from lesson observation, etc. It's very, very important that we get our learners to actively look at models, that we get them to look at the structure, we get them to look at the language, and that will feed into their presentations. So getting them to kind of, if you like, reverse engineer a productive activity. So we look at the result, we look at it receptively, obviously, we reverse engineer it, and then we go into productivity. There's a slight caveat here, there's a slight catch, which I'll talk about in just a moment, because it's arguable with this kind of structure that we're not quite yet in 100% free production. And that's why I wanted to mention these again, because there will be support, there will be, so you have the model, and then you ask your learners to do a similar activity. And there is the possibility here for great production. Remember, I'm talking about spoken production right now, and I'll change that subject in just a second. But what we need to do is to get our learners to think through and to plan. Remember, I said right at the beginning that the less time learners have to prepare, the more cognitive load they're going to have. So giving learners time to prepare their presentation and guidance is going to help them reduce that cognitive load and be more productive in the classroom. The other thing I wanted to say about this particular kind of activity is I think it's very, very important when you are teaching things like presentations, extended monologue, usually done by a learner on their own, that you please discourage them, or if you like, forbid them from using a script. It's absolutely vital if we're going to learn to be productive that at some time we put ourselves out there. Yes, we do our preparation, okay, notes, we have some kind of structure. But if you find that your learners have memorized a speech, that is not really being productive, not in the sense that we want for speaking. It's more like just reading a composition, and that's not where we're going with this. So please, 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 if you're doing extended monologue, if they want to have, just a few notes, just to remind them of the points they're going through, or if they can use a PowerPoint, for example, with some basic bullet points, I'm okay with that. But please don't let them slip back into that memorization. It's not being truly productive. It's not getting them to use their brain right there and right then. Give them useful language, brainstorm ideas with them, talk about a little bit about the level of language they're going to use. We covered this in the tour earlier this year, but just remind them of the dynamic between them and their audience. For those of you who weren't with us on the tour, a very important point is that our audience will change the language, the way we use the language. For example, at conferences, we get more formal. We often speak in the plural, we. If you're representing a company or your school or whatever, do get learners to think about those. Because remember, production is not just about quantity, it's about the effectiveness and the quality of what I'm doing. You can mass produce a load of rubbish. That's not being productive. Being productive is, obviously there's an element of quantity, but quality is absolutely important. And remember, not all our learners will have had the experience of speaking before a crowd of people. How does speaking before a crowd of people change our use of language? What kind of expressions am I going to use? What am I going to avoid? Learners need to cover this, at least in abstract, before you send them away. Now, a very important part, and I mentioned there's a slight caveat with this, that when we're talking a book can also be an absence of knowledge about that, but the examiner doesn't care about the facts and accurate, the English is accurate. Someone made a comment about things like examiners. Please, I've mentioned examinations, but I'm not just talking about exams today. And if we're talking in the real world, not just in an examination, content does become very important, because obviously if we're speaking to people, what we have to say has to have some meaning for that particular moment. And this is where we need to make sure that when we're teaching, especially at the higher levels where examinations I know are a thing, that we also do get learners to focus on content. And this is coming to the next point I'm going to make now. I'm not ignoring the value of exams, but remember my point that we're looking at our learners as users of the language. Users of the language, why do we use the language? Because we have something to express. So getting learners to use language in a meaningful way that conveys true content is a very important part of what we're doing when we're teaching in the classroom, not just exam preparation, although I do accept your point, that, you know, examiners, for those of you who haven't got the chat open, examiners don't care whether the facts are accurate, but the English is accurate. I obviously accept that, but to a certain point. I have worked as an oral examiner in my past, and some of you may have done the same thing. And I do know that when learners come in for an examination, for an oral examination, there's a major shift in the way the examiner feels about the learner if what they're producing is not just in good English, but if it produces or reflects personality, if it shows opinion, if it shows a thoughtfulness. So there is a point at which, certainly for international exams, that's what I can speak to. There is a point at which content matters and not just delivery. The same is true for composition writing. If you think about composition writing, it's going to be, you know, if you're reading a composition which is genuinely interesting, which has ideas, which has maybe facts that you weren't familiar with, there is an automatic kind of more positive feeling, if you like, towards that particular writing or speaking. So I wouldn't divorce it completely from that, although I do accept your point that in things like examinations, the examiners focus much more on the structure of the English. But there's a level at which an interesting interview or a learner who obviously has information can actually nudge those marks up as well. And as I said, I do speak from experience there. So I mentioned presentation skills, but I also said that there is a sense in which presentation skills are not 100% true production. In that there is guidance, there is obviously an instruction to talk about something in particular. What we have to get to as well at the higher levels to be more productive is to get learners to personalize the language much more. So they're not just talking about the content of the book or content that's led by the book, although that has its place and it's very important as a kind of stepping stone. But personalization really, really is the key to getting our learners to develop their productive skills. You've done the groundwork, you've laid the foundations, you've done your grammar, you've done your vocabulary, you've done your useful expressions. Until learners can actually utilize that to talk about things or to write about things that matter to them, that they're interested in, that they want to communicate, I would argue that we're not really moving into true language use. It's crashing, I think it talks about communicative need, that people communicate or learn to communicate or try to communicate better when they have something that they want to say, that the communicative need is there. Presentation skills that are guided doesn't necessarily fall into that category. So it's great practice, but it doesn't take us into full production. What we need to be able to do is to get learners to personalize that language, to feel that communicative need, which will drive their practice and help us to help them improve their language skills. So things like, obviously, one of my favorite ways of doing this, and again, I mention it again, is this idea of things like project work or giving learners some time, once or twice a week, I don't know, depending on how many learners you've got and the structure that you're working with, to come in and talk about anything that interests them and lead a conversation. Try and find space in the lesson. It can be just like 5 minutes on a Friday or whatever. Kind of like the American idea of show and tell, but at a kind of more mature level, where learners are encouraged to talk about anything they're interested in, a hobby, a political situation, something that they're involved with, something they'd like to convince other students to be involved with. their favorite film. I don't care. But at some point, we have to find time and space, especially at the higher levels, or this can work at the lower levels as well, for learners to talk about things, to express themselves when we're looking at speaking, that matter to them. And ideally, to get into some kind of conversation with the students. This also leads to motivation. If I'm talking about something I'm passionate about, something I believe in, or even just a funny thing that happened to me somewhere, then I have a genuine desire to communicate. If I have a genuine desire to communicate, I understand the purpose of what I'm doing, and there is a motivational, hopefully, an increase in motivation at that particular moment. So please, again, when you're looking at the practicalities of getting learners to be more productive, true production kind of comes when we remove the support, when we remove the safety net, when we take away the stabilizers. It's also a great opportunity for you as teachers when learners are kind of freestyling, to use that expression, in the language, to see exactly where they are. If you're doing productive skills that are always at least somewhat controlled, it's going to be a little artificial. It's when learners are communicating about anything they wish that you can start to see how well they're doing, where there are gaps, where they have issues, etc. And again, if you are going to do this, and it should be completely free, anything you like, within reason, things that are legal, things that are moral, whatever, that you have learners come in and they can talk about anything. Give them notification in advance, let them know that this Friday or whenever it happens to be, you're going to be doing this, and get learners to do it, okay? But give them just a little bit of time to think about it. Moving on. Spoken interaction. I just want to make a couple of things here. It's different from production in the sense of monologue, getting learners to communicate. Before you do a speaking activity, and we've touched on these, do your lead-in, get learners to discuss what they know about things, brainstorm the whole thing. What kind of words might we need? What kind of expressions are going to be useful? Allow rehearsal time. So I'm speeding just a little bit here because I want to get to some of the activities before we run out of time. And I want to ask you to do some stuff with me. Allowing rehearsal time, very, very important indeed. I'm sorry, the light seems to be changing. I don't know if I'm disappearing or not, but it's getting very dark here. I hope you can still see me. Use what we call, Stanislavski calls the magic if. Imagine you were. Let's pretend that. Get learners into this idea of putting themselves mentally into a different context, into a different situation, but identify that before they go into the role play or before they go into the particular discussion. The last 12 minutes, which I can see I've got here, I just want to zoom into some ideas, just to throw some ideas around with you about written production. It's a slightly different thing in that learners do have a little more time to prepare, but still they find it very, very hard. What do learners have to get right? I'm going to cover these very, very quickly. Approach, development, clarity, correctness, and style. For me, this is the most complete checklist I've come across when we're training learners to be productive and to be productive in terms of quality, not just quantity. And we're going to go through some of these terms to finish off, and I'm going to try and make sure I have time just to give you a few examples. If questions come up, please feel free to add them. My approach, my written communication, appropriacy of medium. This is something we also discussed when I was here earlier this year. If I'm going to communicate in written form, should it be email? Should it be WhatsApp? Should it be a formal written letter? Should it be a card? What format, what medium will be appropriate and why? Do get learners to think about why we do this in email, why this wouldn't be appropriate as a WhatsApp, why some things are actually better said face to face. Discuss the appropriacy of medium, not just write an email, but why are we doing this in email? Why would this be a handwritten note? Yeah, it doesn't take long, but do think about that because it gets learners into the habit of thinking of not just what they produce, but how they produce it, the format. The tone. What's the appropriate tone? What's the relevancy to the reader here? Why would they want to read it? What am I really trying to get across to them? Are they going to be interested? If not, can I make them interested? And that goes to the next point there, persuasive strategy. We're going to cover a few details on these. I'm not going to stop on this slide terribly long. It's just examples of the kind of medium we want to use. As I've mentioned already, these should be discussed with our learners and the appropriacy of each for each situation. All of them have a place. All of them have a place. If I'm going to try and persuade somebody to do something, what strategies can I use? Learners need to think about this. Am I going to make a logical comment? Am I going to speak to their feelings? Am I going to try and make an ethical argument? Am I going to appeal to a higher authority or an expert? So for example, here, imagine you just started doing some work as a volunteer after school, and you're going to try and persuade your friend that they should do some volunteer work as well. Now, how can I persuade them? What's going to be good? A logical argument? You have lots of free time and you need to fill it, maybe. If I just zoom back, feelings. You know, I know you're getting really bored lately, and I know you haven't got any friends, and I know how miserable you must be, but volunteer work's a great way of finding people and doing stuff together. Ethics. You know, the world is a difficult place right now. There are poor people, or the environment is suffering, and we have an absolute responsibility to take care of these people. Yeah. So you've got different approach there. Credibility as a person. I take the world very, very seriously. I've looked into these things and I've got the data, and I think it's really important that we do something here. So when learners are looking at producing in writing, please ask them to think about the approach they might take. Play about with it, because you can use different strategies to achieve the same aim. Play around with that a little. Ask them how they might do it, given the context. It may not be appropriate to be emotional, for example. Maybe it's more appropriate to be logical. The weather's doing its thing here. Things we have to think when we're training our learners to be productive in writing. And if you don't get time to note all these down, remember this is being recorded and you can go back to it. Learners need to think about logic and coherence. They need to be very explicit about what has to be done if things need to be done. Relevant examples. Sometimes support through quotations can be important. Do get learners to look at that. There are lots of lovely quotation dictionaries online. We all use them. Knowledge and insight, giving their personal experience, giving an explanation of things. Interestingly, the position of conclusion, an interesting point I came across. If you're speaking to a friendly audience who you know you're going to agree with you, you tend to put your conclusion at the beginning. I think that we should do more to protect the environment. Boom. Explanation. If you're speaking to an audience who's not likely to agree with you, you tend to go through the logic first. The world is becoming this. Companies are doing that. We're having problems with the rainforests. Therefore, we should protect the environment. So get them to look at the development, bearing in mind the audience. It's an interesting point that I came across, and it's a very important one. Conclusion doesn't always have to come at the end, and this is true for speaking, by the way, if my audience is either likely to accept or likely to reject me. Okay, I'm just going to jump a slide here. Forgive me for 1 second for looking away from you. I need to get to the next point. What about public speaking? We've always asked students to write the speech and memorize it, even if it's L1. Is that considered wrong? I'm going to be honest with you. No, if you're doing presentation work, then I'm sorry, I really have to politely disagree with writing out and memorizing it. Because essentially what you're doing there is you're asking learners to just read a composition. And you do composition work, I know that you do. If you're doing presentation work, the skills that learners are going to learn to be able to think on their feet and use the language will only come if you take away that safety net. Certainly notes, I have no problem with that. I'm speaking with notes now. My PowerPoint and my note is my notes. But please, it probably is better to move to maybe reduce the time of the presentation, but get them to kind of freestyle it. Do their research, have an idea what they want to say, but memorization is essentially just reading a composition, and it's not working on spoken production. So forgive me for I hope a polite colleague-to-colleague disagreement there. Try it. I think you'll see that there are different things that come up if they're not memorizing the speech. You will find different things out about their language. I'm going to move on because I've got 6 minutes left. I did want to ask you to have a look at some things with me. When you're looking at being productive, now these last couple of slides are notes that I've made based on my experience of proofreading translations, working with the European Union, this kind of thing. When you're working with learners, when they're working in a foreign language, if they're going to be properly productive, do look out for things in their written work. Remember, we're talking about written production, especially things like ambiguity. There are some lovely examples of that on the screen in front of you. Learners, if they're transferring information from kind of their own brain into English, sometimes the structures do lead to ambiguity. Point that out to them when you're marking and help them with that. Again, this speaks to quality. Other things, sorry, I'm going to go past that. You can always look at it again in the video. Some of them are very funny, by the way. Other things to avoid when they're being productive are things like avoiding, to be properly productive, to give quality, we have to be precise in our written work. So comments like, many people say, do they really? How many people have you spoken to? Where is your data? Yeah? It's not a terribly convincing argument. Nobody is convinced by it because everybody knows you don't know that many people. Yeah? So avoid phrases like that. Yeah? And try and be a little more specific. So-and-so has said, this organization believes, my dad told me last night, is better than these kinds of things. Following on things like too much use of the passive. It has been said, by whom? Yeah? These are kind of expressions that come in that don't really communicate. They're not productive in the sense of giving quality. Also learners hedging. Probably, maybe, it could be, if you're going to write, if you're going to speak, you should believe what you're talking about. There are occasions when this is true, when it's necessary, but please, when you're working at the higher levels, when you're working with written work and you're helping your learners, please be a little careful about that. I'm going to jump again, because there's always the feeling that you're never going to have enough, and then you run out of time. Again, looking at things like style here and ambiguity in written work and how we can help our learners be more effective productively. Thank you very much for the time. I do have my eye on the thing and I'll be finished because I can cut out a couple of things. Look out for misuse of language. Learners have a tendency, especially at the higher levels, to get overly complex. These on the screen are sentences that I came across in proofreading. Style guides, etc., ask us to move away from this. Now, I was going to ask you to do this with me. Do it in your heads. I'm just going to look at a couple of them for you to look at things that we can avoid to help with the clarity and the quality of the production in written form. For example, as well as the procedure for the submission of the report, that could equally be rephrased as how the report should be submitted. Avoid learners getting very verbose. There is a tendency, especially amongst older learners, especially adult learners, for their language to get very confused and very verbose, especially if you're writing in a foreign language. Keep it simple. Yeah? To conduct an investigation. Why do you conduct an investigation? To investigate. If you want learners to be productive in the sense of quality, when you're marking their work, do look at things like this. It's not about being simple, it's about being direct. It's about communicating directly. And I have found, and this happens at exam levels as well, and I've seen it in some examiners' reports, that learners tend to get very verbose and overcomplicated. Direct communication, clear, concise, okay? So please look out for things like that in their work. This is, by the way, written by non-native speakers, in this case, translators. There's a big danger that they think they have to use overly formal language when they're writing. Formality does not mean verbose. Please look out for that. It's something, these are traps that learners then fall into when they're being productive in writing. As I said, I wanted to mention details here, not so much the idea of the broader skills. Going for the details, looking at things like the punctuation, watching out for ambiguity, simplifying things not to make it baby level, but to make it more direct. The final minute, please remember that there are different ways of assessing production in speaking and writing. As teacher, obviously, you're going to do that. Be aware whether it's whether it's meaning focused or form focused. Focus on those when you are assessing. If it's a speaking activity, if it's meaning focused, please wait till the end and give notes. If it's form focused, okay, you can correct immediately. But when learners are doing speaking activities, either pair work or whatever, take a seat, make notes, and then look at it. We need to encourage learners to assess themselves, but that assessment has to be formative. So when you ask a learner, how did you do in an activity? Please ask them what they need to put it right. I've forgotten the passive voice. I didn't remember the word for. Not just, I didn't do well. Get learners to focus. 30 seconds just for peer assessment, and I'm done. When we're doing peer assessment, please remember to give criteria before learners assess. What are you looking for? and how are they supposed to assess it? These are some ideas, some things to think about, much bigger discussion than we can cover today. Thank you very much for joining me. Thank you very much for inviting me to the conference. It's always a great pleasure to talk to you guys, and I look forward to doing it face to face in the very near future.